The morning had felt almost sacred, as Harold Mitchell stood in his daughter's Denver kitchen, warming his hands around a cup of coffee, while sunlight spread across the Rockies like a slow-moving blessing. At 73, he carried the weight of decades working for the Forest Service. Years of chainsaws, rescue missions, trail repairs, and the kind of honest labor that left your body tired but your conscience clean. His wife, Dorothy, moved gently through the kitchen, her silver hair pinned back, her steps stiff from years of teaching and bending down to meet the eyes of children who needed reassurance more than instruction. Their daughter, Sarah, fussed over sandwiches and weather reports, as daughters do when the people who once seemed indestructible begin to look a little fragile in winter light. "Stay another day," she urged, the way adult children do when love mixes with worry. But Harold smiled with the easy confidence of a man who'd driven through 1,000 storms. They said their goodbyes in the driveway, exchanging hugs layered with unspoken gratitude, unspoken fear, unspoken knowledge that winter roads aren't friendly to aging bones. By 9 o'clock, the couple was buckled into their old Subaru, thermos rattling in the cup holder, country music humming through static. The road stretched ahead, familiar and deceivingly gentle, unaware that before nightfall, the world would strip them down to the purest form of human will, and lead them into a place where survival and fate collided with a secret no one had meant to leave behind. Snow began innocently enough, soft flakes drifting over the highway like feathers shaken loose from a quiet sky. Harold kept one hand on the wheel and one resting where Dorothy could touch it, their old rhythm needing no words. But within an hour, the world had narrowed into shifting white walls, the kind of blizzard that swallowed distance and sense alike. The Subaru climbed the mountain pass steadily, until, without warning, it coughed like a wounded animal. The engine wheezed once, twice, then surrendered altogether, leaving them adrift in a roaring whiteness that erased the road, their bearings, and hope in equal measure. "No signal," Harold muttered, tapping his phone as if willing it alive. The temperature sank fast. Their breath fogged the cabin, frosting the windows from the inside. Dorothy's voice was calm but edged with fear's shadow as she recalled seeing a dark shape through the storm, a structure, maybe a roofline. They made the decision together, not out of bravery but necessity. With scarves pulled high and numb fingers gripping each other tightly, they stepped into the blizzard, moving like small figures swallowed by a furious living thing. Each step sank deep, each breath burned cold, each gust threatened to spin them into disorientation. But just as Harold began to doubt the memory of Dorothy's sighting, his outstretched hand struck wood, a solid wall in a world of shifting chaos. A cabin, real, present. A shelter dropped into their path like a last-minute mercy from a universe that still believed in second chances. Harold kicked through the locked door with the strength of a man who had no other choices left, and together they stumbled into darkness so quiet it felt like falling underwater. As the wind shrieked behind the closed door, the silence became a blessing, an invisible blanket wrapping around their shaken bodies. When Harold finally lifted his flashlight, the beam revealed something unexpected. This wasn't a hunter's shack or an emergency shelter. This was a home, well-built, comfortably furnished, and eerily preserved as if its owner had stepped out moments ago and forgotten to return. Leather chairs faced a stone fireplace. A clock on the mantel sat frozen at 3:15. Dust clung to surfaces, but nothing suggested decay or abandonment, only absence. Dorothy moved through the space with cautious wonder, trailing her fingers across a dining table where 6 chairs were neatly tucked in. The kitchen held dishes, canned food, even a half-used box of matches. Everything felt intentionally stocked, intentionally maintained, and yet intentionally anonymous. No photographs, no personal belongings. No indicator of who lived there or why they'd walked away. As the fire crackled to life, warmth slowly seeped back into their bones, allowing the shock of survival to settle into gratitude and unease. They ate a simple meal in front of the fire, their bodies thawing but their minds circling the same silent question. Who prepares a place so carefully and then vanishes without a trace? And why did this cabin feel less like shelter and more like a secret waiting in the dark? Night pressed against the windows like a living thing, and Harold drifted into uneasy sleep while Dorothy kept watch. Hours later, she shook him awake, her voice hushed but urgent. "There's someone else here," she whispered, not upstairs, below. A faint creak had risen from beneath the floorboards, too deliberate to be a settling beam or shifting frost. With the fireplace poker gripped tight, Harold followed Dorothy toward a narrow door tucked beside the pantry. It blended so seamlessly with the wall that he wondered how they'd missed it before. When he opened it, cold air spilled upward from a staircase descending into shadowed stone. They moved together, step by careful step, their flashlight carving a fragile tunnel of light through the darkness. At the bottom lay a large, clean basement, far larger than the cabin above suggested. A heavy oak desk sat centered in the room, its surface neatly arranged with papers. Filing cabinets lined one wall. Then in the far corner, Harold's light struck something massive and metallic. A vault, not a household safe, but a bank-grade giant standing 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, its steel door gleaming like a relic from a heist film. Dorothy skimmed the documents on the desk, utility bills and maintenance logs addressed only to a faceless LLC. Everything felt intentionally obscured, intentionally protected. "Someone hid more than a home here," she murmured. Harold studied the safe with the practiced eye of a man who'd known old equipment all his life. And as the storm raged overhead, they stood before a locked truth waiting to alter everything they believed about this quiet mountain and the strangers who once walked it. Dawn revealed no miracle rescue, only acres of buried world and a car swallowed completely by snow. Over coffee, Harold and Dorothy faced the decision that had been quietly forming since the basement discovery. Not to steal. Not to pry for selfish reasons, but to understand what kind of secret had been preserved in that steel vault beneath their feet. Harold's old ranger instincts stirred as he knelt before the safe, noticing faint wear along the dial, scratches left by repeated use. He worked slowly, methodically, turning the dial with the patience of a man who'd spent years opening forgotten cabins and stuck maintenance locks. When the tumblers finally clicked, it sounded like the cabin itself exhaled. Together they pulled the heavy door open. What waited inside left them breathless. Bundles of crisp $100 bills packed from floor to ceiling, neatly banded and stacked with clinical precision. Not thousands, not millions. A fortune far beyond anything either of them had ever imagined. But the money was only the surface. Behind it lay waterproof document cases, leather-bound ledgers, news clippings, each item placed with care by someone who believed deeply in keeping it hidden. Dorothy opened the first ledger, her voice tightening as she read. Page after page documented transfers, liquidations, retirement accounts drained dry. Victims listed by name, age, and loss, hundreds of them. And one name brought Harold to his knees, his uncle. The quiet man who died thinking he'd simply made bad financial decisions. In the dim basement, surrounded by stolen wealth, Harold felt grief, anger, and obligation collide in a way that reshaped the very air he breathed. More documents revealed the truth like a wound reopening under bright light. Newspaper clippings detailed the disappearance of a Denver financial advisor named Marcus Trent, once respected, later infamous for embezzling millions from elderly clients whose trust had been his only currency. The case had gone cold decades ago. Trent had vanished, leaving devastation behind. Yet here in this frozen cabin lay his entire empire of theft, untouched and perfectly preserved. A letter dated only a few years earlier exposed the thief's twisted philosophy, self-justification dressed up as rebellion, arrogance disguised as entitlement. Dorothy read each line with a kind of sorrowful anger, shaking her head as if she could erase the ink itself. They uncovered documents listing Trent's multiple identities, offshore accounts, property acquisitions, and even the note estimating his total net worth. Over $300 million. The most shocking revelation came from a set of county papers explaining that Trent had died right here, alone. His body so decomposed when discovered that no one recognized him. The cabin had simply fallen into bureaucratic limbo, forgotten until Harold and Dorothy stumbled upon it. The basement felt colder then, not from temperature, but from the heavy presence of a man who had built an entire life around betrayal and died unclaimed. As Harold stared at the rows of cash, he felt a dangerous thought whisper through him, "Take it." After all they'd endured in their lives, after seeing what their family had lost, wasn't it owed to them? But morality is a stubborn companion, and Dorothy's voice reminded him that some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. They spent hours sitting together on the cold basement floor, the fortune looming behind them like a silent judge. Harold found himself unraveling years of quiet suffering, medical bills they couldn't pay, the cabin they had sold, the second jobs, the dreams postponed until they quietly became impossible. Dorothy answered his grief with her own, recounting her father's dementia, the nursing home costs that drained her savings, The wedding funds for their daughter that dwindled because something always broke, always needed fixing, always came before joy. For a moment, just a moment, the idea of taking the money seemed like reclaiming justice from the jaws of a cruel world. But then Dorothy rested her hand on the red ledger, the one filled with names of men and women who had died poorer than they deserved. "If we take this," she whispered, "we become part of the harm." And Harold knew she was right. They documented everything, photographing ledgers, scanning pages, recording details so meticulously that any investigator could retrace their steps. When the storm finally eased, Harold called the FBI with trembling fingers. His voice was steady but heavy as he explained what they'd found. Hours later, helicopters carved through the quiet morning, agents filing into the cabin with solemn reverence. They opened the safe, examined the evidence, and confirmed what Dorothy and Harold already knew. They had uncovered one of the largest unsolved financial crimes in state history. And instead of taking riches, they had chosen to return accountability to people who had lost everything decades before. When the agents finished collecting evidence, and the noise of boots and clipped voices faded, Harold and Dorothy stood alone once more in the cabin's quiet. The officials called them heroes, though Harold felt anything but heroic, just tired, relieved, and strangely at peace. The world would soon learn their names, and journalists would scramble to paint them as symbols of rare integrity in a brittle age. Yet for Harold and Dorothy, the truth was simpler. They had protected their own souls. As the sun rose over the mountains, turning the snow into a glittering field of light, Harold realized something profound.